So, with that sort of like level of exposure to the craziness behind the scenes, hi, thank you for joining us. I do see a familiar name up at the top, so thanks for coming back and giving us a second try. It's nice to see you here again. My name is Danika and I am from Danika Inc. The same pun stands. It's named Danika Inc. because I figured it was the only thing that wouldn't change over the course of my life. And so now I am here with two amazing colleagues, Renee and Kate, and we all hold expertise in different spaces around female health and health more generally as well. So we are in the third installment of our partnership with Yoga Nova Studios, and today we're talking about chronic and acute care and health during times of pandemic. The expectations for today I think are going to be really interesting around, we're going to be touching on how this interface, like chronic and acute illnesses interface with COVID-19, but also some of the other pieces that we're kind of starting to notice and pull from. And we realized that this was just like a super hard topic to really go through without sticking to any specific illness. So I thought what would be really, really useful is if we just start off with Renee introducing herself really briefly and then getting into where the North American context is with COVID-19 as of today.
Hi, I'm Renee. I'm part of Danika Inc.'s R&D team. Hopefully you can hear me. As part of the technical difficulties today, my headphones died. So I'm seeing some nodding, which is good. A little bit about myself. I'm now just finishing up my master's in epidemiology, and so that's the study of the distribution and the determinants of disease. And really, I focus on kind of this clustering of risk factors or chronic conditions. So obesity, diabetes, hypertension, kind of those things, and how they relate to cancer survival. And so this is kind of an interesting place for me to be today talking about this, because I personally don't experience any of these conditions, but I know a lot of people do. And so hopefully it's somewhat relevant. I looked at some of the stats today from kind of the Canadian context and then some bit more from the US. And so in Canada, just kind of that brief overview is that both men and women are getting COVID-19. It's pretty split. And then what I found actually more interesting was the fact that only a third of people who have COVID-19 are above the age of 60. And so we always kind of go, oh my goodness, we're young, where it's not going to be as impacted, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not really seeming like it's the case anymore. I kind of think we all have this idea that those who are older are more maybe susceptible to it. But from these kind of numbers, that's not what's showing up. A little bit, I'm going to kind of geek out here for a moment, but from the States, there was a paper published yesterday, and I know I'm the only one that gets excited about things like this, but here we are. And so yesterday, they published out of New York, and they were looking at how people with different chronic conditions kind of had different outcomes in terms of mortality, in terms of recovery, in terms of being in the ICU, and so on. And some of the really interesting things that came out of that paper was showing that people who were older were more likely to be ventilated, and that was a huge, huge risk factor for mortality. But talking about chronic conditions today, we know that people that had diabetes or hypertension or even obesity were more likely to be the people that ended up getting ventilated. And so kind of the compounding impact of these comorbidities together. I know at Danika Inc., we also find that this is kind of talking about vulnerable populations are very important to us, since some of our staff have vulnerabilities as well as some of our loved ones. So with that, I'm going to let Kate take it away and kind of touch on that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So for any of you guys who are new, my name is Kate, and I am the clinic director at Studio D under the Danika Inc. umbrella, and I'm also a certified athletic therapist. I am also, importantly for this episode, part of that vulnerable population in that I have ulcerative colitis, and I am on biologic medications that lower my immune system. So I fall into that vulnerable population when it comes to COVID-19, which is a really interesting thing to place myself in as a healthcare practitioner and somebody that works in this field. To now be part of a vulnerable population is interesting and has been quite a journey, a dynamic journey, as things have changed, and as things have changed throughout the progression of COVID-19. And so I think this kind of leads into what we wanted to talk about today, in these vulnerable populations and barriers that have come up or been removed, and the ramifications of that. And so one of the things that we've talked about lots as we were prepping for this is barriers that may look like they've been removed but maybe have some bias behind them. And so one of the big things that I've experienced personally, and the ulcerative Crohn's colitis community in general, there's lots of places, grocery stores, etc., that have actually opened up times for this vulnerable population to shop. So the elderly, or people that might be sick, or people with immunocompromised conditions, and that's amazing, and it's really, really exciting. Except that it's really exciting in principle, and in practice it's actually a little bit tricky, because as a young, healthy looking person, when I arrive at a grocery shop in the morning during that period of time to do my shopping, in that vulnerable period of time where that grocery store is more clean and less people in it, I might get turned away. I have 2 or 3 friends that have tried to go to those time periods in different cities, and they've shown up and they look healthy and they're young, and the store person will say, well, this is for vulnerable people and sick people. And they're like, well, I'm on biologics, or I'm X, Y, and Z, and I am part of this vulnerable population. And there's been all sorts of different reactions to that, but lots of, prove it. And that's so sad to hear, being that these kind of measures are put in place to try to help this population. But as a society, we have all these biases around what a vulnerable population actually looks like. And so, Renee, would you mind kind of shedding some light on what that traditionally looks like?
For sure. So I did look up Health Canada, because I thought that'd be a great place to start in kind of the midst of all this. And they do a pretty good job, from my opinion, right? What's that worth? But talking about the different factors in terms of kind of the economic or barriers to access, or people that do have either comorbidities or like reduced immune systems. I do think one of the things that they leave out are kind of those individual characteristics. So things about age, things about maybe sex and gender, and kind of racial backgrounds. Those identity factors aren't covered in their definitions. And I think those are kind of the factors that you're touching on, Kate. I know Danika wanted to jump in here with something.
Just a little bit around, so my background in sociocultural scholarship really lends to the conversation here around messiness, and I thought this would be a good moment to talk reflexively about even the troubles and challenges we had in just talking about chronic and acute illness. So I think that not having gender, sex, age, and ethnicity considered in what a vulnerable population is pretty outlandish. We have examples in Alberta specifically of an otherwise healthy population, but all happening to work out of one particular processing plant getting ill, and they all come from immigrant families and lower socioeconomic status. And that was enough of a risk factor for them to be vulnerable to this. And I don't think that's what we're including when we talk about vulnerable populations and the grocery store, right? It's just such an interesting and challenging concept to work your way around. And unlike Kate, so I am a vulnerable person, and I have not been leaving my house, but I look pretty healthy, and it's almost worked out in my favor, because sending my husband to go, oh, I have a vulnerable life and I'm here, like they can imagine some like glassy, pale, Victorian-esque looking I mean, I meet those, but I'm pretty pale as is, but it is almost easier in that way, because it's left to that person's imagination and bias to decide how sickly I look versus what I may or may not look like from their understanding of what a vulnerable person is. And I think that speaks so much to the human experience of like, who is vulnerable, who qualifies as vulnerable, and how do we adapt our society for those chronic conditions. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, but as a person, I usually share with my friends and family that I am susceptible to being hospitalized just from getting a cold. And I have some friends who are so amazing about it. And they're like, I have a sniffle. Would you like me to, like, even clients at the clinic, they're like, I have a sniffle. Would you like me to cancel my appointment with you today? I'd hate for you to get ill. That was like those amazing outliers. And now everyone's doing that. And so that's been a really interesting transition for me, and people respecting what is it to be immunocompromised, and how do I, as a non-immunocompromised person, play into like the social and societal expectations around managing that, and what is herd immunity actually, right? Like going way off into left field there.
Yeah, as this draws out more and more, it's gonna be more and more where we evolve in this area and what perceptions change. And I think there's that whole idea around an invisible illness and looking healthy but not being healthy, and how much of a crippling barrier that is for people with these invisible illnesses. And you're right. What one amazing silver lining that COVID has done is it has brought this whole area, whether your perception or your bias is there or not, but it has brought this into the limelight, and people are talking about it. And that's the first step, right? And so the longer this goes on, the more recognition and the more people are talking about this, the more change we might actually see down the line around this area.
Yeah, and even just for Kate, speaking to your experiences, I know that you've been waiting for some like medication changes. I don't know exactly how long you've been waiting, but so I'm worried about not getting my medicine, but you seem to be able to get your medicine easier than ever.
I know that is probably the best silver lining that has come out of this whole endeavor, is that I very, very recently went onto the biologic medications. And one of the most fearful things for me when going onto a biological medication was not actually going onto the medication, because I knew it would make me feel better and, make me healthier in the long run. But it was being tied to an infusion clinic every 6 weeks as somebody that's spontaneous and likes to travel and has family all over the place, before COVID-19 happened. Being tied to one spot really, really scared me. And so in the back burner of my illness, lots of these medications have been pushing to have at-home injection kits, processed through all the levels that they have to go through before they're approved for market. And so one amazing thing that happened during this time is that the Canadian government actually pushed through my medication like months and months and months and months ahead of schedule, so that a vulnerable population doesn't have to go into a clinic to get their medication. So instead of this medication being cleared next year, it's actually already been cleared. It was cleared a couple weeks ago, and so the at-home kits will be available coming up pretty soon here in the future, and they'll mail it to my door. I don't have to leave my house. I don't have to go into a place where I'm putting myself at risk or my loved ones at risk for other people in my life who may be vulnerable. And that's huge. Like peace of mind, accessibility, that's huge. And I think my situation is very unique in my illness and my specific medication, but for everybody out there that is in that vulnerable population, going and looking at, what has become accessible during this time. Is my medication changing? Are my support groups changing? There's going to be a lot of dynamic movement in this, in the world of chronic and acute illnesses. And so I think, having people on the lookout for what might be adapting and what barriers might be changing is huge right now. I think we're in a very dynamic time, both in a confusing, complicated way, but also in a really progressive, pushing the boundaries, moving forward way. It's actually exciting in some ways.
What's terrifying is things like some scheduled surgeries aren't happening anymore, right? When we're talking about barriers and how that's working, but in this selfish, self-interested kind of way. So my grandma was grocery shopping in the special vulnerable people. My grandma has cancer right now, and my grandma's obviously an older woman. And she fell down and broke her hip while she was doing the low-risk grocery shopping, which is an irony that does not escape her. She has never been more embarrassed in her life, and when she called me to tell me, she was like beside herself with embarrassment. And she got in to see a surgeon within 24 hours of breaking her hip. That never would have happened otherwise. It was phenomenal. And so because all of these scheduled surgeries had been canceled, she was able to just pop in there, get it done, get it dealt with. And she was let out of the hospital yesterday, and she's had access to rehabilitation a little bit earlier than she otherwise would have. There are certain components that are just is so cool that are kind of like coming out of the woodwork that you wouldn't expect as silver linings to this. That being said, people like Kate and I aren't considered essential services, and I know people who are coming out of surgery, they've done their rehab that they can do in hospital, and they can't access ongoing care to rehabilitate their knees or their hips after these surgeries. And so I think that's the difference between that chronic and acute split kind of in that capacity, right? You've got the emergencies dealt with quite tidily at this point because the hospitals are running a little bit more efficiently. But how do you get access to some of those, I don't mean complimentary as in free, but like complementary as in like, they're spelled differently. They're not pronounced differently, and that kills me a little bit. And I think that's an interesting lens. Brittany, you were going to say something?
I was just going to jump on that kind of that chronic condition side of things. And I heard today, actually, I'm associated with like the cancer institutes here in town, or in Calgary, I should say. And so in their meeting today, they were talking about how that support person that normally kind of takes somebody or is with somebody during cancer treatments is no longer allowed in the building.
Yeah.
And so that has caused obviously some backlash because that's your whole support system. And so I think that's going to be a really interesting one, is that sure, the acute side might actually have some benefits right now, or some kind of silver linings as we're calling it, but that chronic condition and that who can drive somebody to an appointment now, who can come into the room, and all those other things, and these very kind of scary instances, I think that's going to have some long-term effects. And I can speak to my grandmother who has dementia, and she can't have any visitors right now because she's too high risk. And so she doesn't really recognize what's going on, and she doesn't remember that there's a pandemic. And so that's a really hard scenario going on, like in my own family. So I can only imagine kind of the extent it goes to. And I know, Danika, you were saying that some, like your grandparents were having a little bit more of a difficult time getting to some appointments now.
Yeah, I mean, so hey, we're at our 10 minutes for questions mark, so I'm going to launch into a story, but please, if you have questions, comments, concerns, you want to make fun of my family for being an absolute gong show, like, contribute. I would love that. But so my grandma was at the lowest grocery shopping, and my grandpa was in for chemo treatment, and my grandma had like popped away because she can't go in, she can't wait for him, so she's like, I'll go do low risk grocery shopping, and then I'll come back and get you, and we'll go quarantine ourselves, and we'll be fine. And so when my grandma broke her hip and had to get taken away in the ambulance, there was no one to pick up my grandpa from cancer treatment, and so my uncle went and picked up my grandpa without quarantining himself or anything, unfortunately, but that's the nature of emergencies. And my grandpa thought my uncle was pranking him the entire way back. So it wasn't until my grandpa got like dropped off at home and told like, no, like she's not coming, that he was like, oh, and then he felt terrible. And so now my mom and my uncle are both like taking turns. They've now removed themselves and their partners from the like being able to interact with society population. They've both completely self-isolated and quarantined to try and keep my grandpa safe because they're now the commuters of him to and from his chemotherapy appointments. And it's expanded to a larger population that's being affected by this vulnerability than just a nuclear family. So it's been really interesting watching what those consequences look like for those chronic conditions and how we can word ourselves with exposure. Yeah, gong show. And poor grandpa. It felt awful.
Yeah, with all of these topics that we talk about, there's always the want to talk about the positive side of things and the silver lining, but the reality is these are really difficult times, and there aren't silver linings for every demographic of this and every area of this, and it's important, like Renee said, to draw attention to some of the areas where it's really difficult, and we're gonna have to adapt and figure out ways to be support people, be the support person for this demographic that there's not as much wiggle room there. We have to adapt around that.
Yeah, this is totally off topic, but I think Renee is a mountain person, Kate is a mountain person, I am a mountain person, we all love mountains, and so if you're part of the kind of backcountry community or the alpine community in Alberta, people have feelings about not being able to go into the alpine. Like, feelings. Because they're like, I'm low risk. I don't, like, everything's fine. I'm healthy. I won't get into an accident, which makes me go, do you understand the definition of an accident? But also, the big concern, and I hadn't thought about it, is we have cut our emergency response teams for our alpine services and rescue services. And so if somebody had to go rescue someone right now, and they were exposed to a person, they would then have to quarantine themselves. And so you lose like a third of your rescue capacity just by somebody having an accident. And is that domino effect of exposure and trying to mitigate that in a professional capacity. And I just find that so fascinating because, like we talked about, like vulnerability and being aware of immunocompromised populations, I don't think at a societal level we have ever been this aware before. Like, who thinks about the consequences of meeting one person and taking out an entire team of stars professionals? Like, that's insane. Sorry. I like to bring things back to the mountains. Especially since I haven't left my house in over a month.
No, it's great, and it's so true. I don't think there's very many times that we're asked, in a risky situation, to think it's really not about you. It's about every single person that you're going to affect in that risky, situation. And I mean, even talking about the search and rescue, in order to come rescue somebody, they have to don full protective gear, which is now taking protective gear away from all the other places that need and are having a shortage of protective gear. And so, yeah, like, trust me, all I want to do is go to the mountains, and everybody I know wants to go to the mountains. But there's always going to be that risk of, if something happens and they have to come get you, what is the risk there? Yeah. And you're right, it's just a domino effect.
I love
Absolutely.
That. Renee, we have some really, I'm not seeing a ton of questions coming up in the chat box, so I do this every week. I feel like I just throw you under the bus. Can you talk to us a little bit about risk statistics? And like, don't go too far down the rabbit hole. Don't show us exactly how much of a genius you are. But like, you and I have talked many times about how the general population cannot like interpret risk factors for themselves. Could you share like one or two cool facts that we should know? Some takeaways for today? Yeah, some risk takeaways.
I'm doing a lot of biostats right now, and so my immediate thought went to this kind of famous line from my biostatistician prof and kind of one of my mentors, and that is that we typically confuse risk with hazard. And so when we talk about risk, it's the idea that something might happen, the incidence of something. But when we're talking about kind of the time it takes till something happens, so when we talk about survival or like something along those lines, we are actually talking about hazard. And that is not the fun fact you were looking for at all, but that is like the preaching lesson from so much schooling is risk is not hazard. And if you could recite that, you would just pass the class. But I think, like, kind of from a public health standpoint, a lot of people don't consider certain risk factors, right? So we go, oh, you have a risk factor for a certain condition, but somebody might not look at going, oh, well, what socioeconomic status are you? And that being a risk factor, or the neighborhood you live in and how that contributes to walkability and then physical activity. And so I think I'm going to say Danika and I, Kate, maybe if you've listened to us talk enough, we say risk factor, and I think we mean different things than the general population typically says. Risk factors isn't like smoking. Everybody's like, yes, that's a risk factor. But risk factors as in your gender isn't quite as at the forefront. And I think that's kind of what our talk has been about today.
Yeah, man, we've done this entire thing backwards. We should have started off with defining risk and hazard. My eyes actually lit up. Renee and I both did our masters in risk, but from completely different lenses. And I think one of the interesting components for me as a sociocultural person is around like, we were making fun of Americans lovingly before the phone call started around how there's been a lot of surprise about the seemingly anomalous and maybe overweighted impact that it's having, unfortunately, that COVID-19 is having on African American populations in the US. But from a risk perspective, that shouldn't be unexpected at all. There's a ton of systemic factors that would obviously play into that being a more vulnerable population, regardless of how healthy that population may look from the outside. And one of the other really big commentaries that Renee and Kate and I had even before we hopped on the call was that gender is actively being excluded. I read some really great articles around like, we have decided not to capture this data, and I find that a phenomenal oversight. Renee, if you want to add anything to that, we're coming right into the end of this. But it's craziness.
Did you see the hand gestures? I feel like you, Danika. I had the hand gestures coming. Yeah, like it's just kind of one of those facepalm moments, right? Like there's no other way of kind of talking about it being like, are you kidding me? And wouldn't that be great if that's the last sentence in our talk today? Are you kidding me?
Amazing. Okay, we'll hand it up there. So next week we're talking a little bit about what we see as the next steps, the futures of health as we go through this. So talking about kind of lifestyle adjustments and more of like the traditional health, wellness, and fitness pieces, obviously still through the unique lenses and expertise that we bring to the conversation. Today's talk was a little bit sponsored by messiness. How crazy and interrelated all of these chronic and continuing vulnerabilities are, and they might not be what you think they are. So, thank you for joining us. We'll see you again here, 4:30 next Thursday, and we'll talk to you soon.